What would you do if you saw someone spit in the face of a royal guard? Imagine the shock, the anger, the disbelief. Now, imagine what happens next leaves everyone speechless. This is not just a story about racism, it's a story about dignity, courage, and the unexpected twists that life throws at us. If you're ready to dive into a tale that will keep you on the edge of your seat, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell, because this is a story you won't want to miss. The sun was setting over Buckingham Palace, casting a golden glow over the iconic building. The air was crisp, and the usual crowd of tourists had thinned out, leaving only a few stragglers taking photos and admiring the grandeur of the palace. Among them was a man named John, a middle-aged tourist from the United States, who had always dreamed of visiting London. He was dressed in a casual outfit, complete with a baseball cap and sunglasses, and he was busy snapping pictures on his phone. Standing tall and immovable in front of the palace gates was a royal guard, a black man named Marcus. Marcus was a seasoned soldier, having served in the military for over a decade before being selected for this prestigious role. His uniform was impeccable, his posture perfect, and his expression stoic. He was the very picture of discipline and professionalism. But as the evening wore on, something unexpected happened. John, who had been drinking earlier in the day, began to feel emboldened by the alcohol coursing through his veins. He started making snide comments under his breath, loud enough for those nearby to hear but not loud enough to draw immediate attention. His words were laced with racism, and they were directed at Marcus. At first, Marcus remained unfazed. He had been trained to ignore provocation, to stand his ground no matter what. But John's behavior escalated. He began to shout, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. The few remaining tourists turned to look, their expressions a mix of shock and discomfort. Then, in a moment that seemed to freeze time, John stepped forward and spat in Marcus's face. The crowd gasped. The sound of the spit hitting Marcus's cheek was sickening, and for a moment, no one moved. Marcus's eyes narrowed, but he didn't flinch. He didn't break his stance. He simply stood there, his face a mask of calm, as the spit slowly dripped down his cheek. John laughed, a cruel mocking sound that echoed in the silence. "What are you gonna do, huh?" he taunted. "You're just a statue, aren't you? A puppet in a fancy uniform." The tension in the air was palpable. The tourists looked on, unsure of what to do. Some reached for their phones, ready to capture whatever happened next. Others whispered to each other, their voices filled with concern. But Marcus didn't react. He didn't move. He just stood there, his eyes locked on John, his expression unreadable. And then, just as the crowd began to think that nothing would happen, Marcus did something that no one expected. He smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile, nor was it a smile of amusement. It was a smile that sent a chill down John's spine, a smile that made the crowd hold their breath. It was a smile that said, "You have no idea what's coming." John's laughter died in his throat. He took a step back, suddenly unsure of himself. The crowd leaned in, their eyes wide with anticipation. And then, without warning, Marcus moved. But what did he do? What could possibly happen next? The crowd was on the edge of their seats, their hearts pounding in their chests. The tension was unbearable, the suspense almost too much to handle. But before we find out what Marcus did, let's rewind a bit. Let's go back to the beginning of this story, to understand how we got to this moment, and to see what led John to make such a terrible decision. It all started earlier that day, when John arrived in London. He had been excited to explore the city, to see the sights and experience the culture. But as the day went on, things began to go wrong. He missed his tour bus, got lost in the winding streets, and ended up in a part of the city that made him feel uncomfortable. The people around him were different, their accents unfamiliar, and John found himself feeling out of place. By the time he reached Buckingham Palace, he was tired, frustrated, and more than a little drunk. He had stopped at a pub along the way, hoping to drown his frustrations in a pint of beer. But the alcohol only made things worse. It loosened his tongue, lowered his inhibitions, and brought out the worst in him. As he stood in front of the palace, his eyes fell on Marcus. The sight of a black man in such a prestigious role seemed to trigger something deep within him. Maybe it was jealousy, maybe it was ignorance, or maybe it was just the alcohol talking. Whatever it was, it led him to make a decision that would change everything. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The story is just beginning, and there's so much more to uncover. What will happen to John? How will Marcus respond? And what will the crowd do? Stay tuned, because this is just the beginning. The next chapter will reveal more, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. But for now, let's leave it here, with Marcus's smile still lingering in the air, and the crowd holding their breath, waiting to see what happens next. What do you think Marcus will do? Will he break his stoic demeanor and confront John? Or will he continue to stand his ground, showing the world what true dignity looks like? The answers are coming, but for now, the suspense is killing us. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, because this story is far from over. Fasten your seatbelt as we dive deeper into the events that unfolded that day, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. The crowd was frozen in place, their eyes glued to Marcus as he stood there, his smile still etched on his face. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. No one knew what to expect, but everyone knew that something big was about to happen. John, the man who had spat in Marcus's face, was now visibly shaken. His bravado had evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of dread. He took another step back, his eyes darting around as if looking for an escape route. But there was nowhere to go. The crowd had formed a semicircle around him, their phones still recording, their faces a mix of shock and anticipation. Marcus, meanwhile, remained calm. He didn't rush, didn't panic. He simply stood there, his eyes locked on John, his smile never wavering. It was as if he was waiting for something, biding his time. And then finally he spoke. "Do you know why I'm here?" Marcus's voice was deep, steady, and filled with authority. It was a voice that commanded attention, a voice that made everyone in the crowd stop and listen. John didn't answer. He just stared at Marcus, his mouth hanging open, his face pale. "I'm here to protect this palace," Marcus continued, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here to uphold the values of honor, respect, and dignity. And I'm here to stand as a symbol of the strength and resilience of this nation." The crowd was silent, hanging on Marcus's every word. Even John seemed to be listening, his earlier arrogance completely gone. "But you," Marcus said, his eyes narrowing as he focused on John, "you have disrespected not just me, but everything I stand for. You have shown ignorance, hatred, and cowardice. And for that, there will be consequences." John's eyes widened in fear. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was completely at a loss, unsure of what to do or say. Marcus took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. The crowd held their breath, their eyes wide with anticipation. What was he going to do? Was he going to strike John? Arrest him? Or something else entirely? But before Marcus could do anything, a voice rang out from the crowd. "Leave him alone." Everyone turned to see a woman pushing her way through the crowd. She was in her late 20s, with long blonde hair and a determined look on her face. She stepped forward, placing herself between Marcus and John. "He's had too much to drink," the woman said, her voice firm but not unkind. "He didn't mean it. Just let him go." Marcus looked at the woman, his expression unreadable. For a moment, no one spoke. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. And then, finally, Marcus nodded. "Very well," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But he will leave. Now." The woman nodded, relief washing over her face. She turned to John, grabbing his arm and pulling him away from the crowd. John didn't resist. He was too shaken, too scared to do anything but follow. The crowd watched as the woman led John away, their eyes still wide with shock. No one knew what to say or do. The incident had been so sudden, so shocking, that it left everyone speechless. But Marcus wasn't done. He turned to the crowd, his eyes scanning the faces before him. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," he said, his voice strong and clear. "Hatred and ignorance have no place here. We are all equal, regardless of the color of our skin, our background, or our beliefs. And anyone who thinks otherwise will face the consequences." The crowd was silent, their eyes fixed on Marcus. No one dared to speak, no one dared to move. They were all too stunned by what had just happened. And then finally, Marcus turned and walked back to his post, his posture as straight and proud as ever. The crowd watched him go, their minds still reeling from the events that had just unfolded. But the story doesn't end here. In fact, it's just the beginning. Because what happened next would shock everyone even more. As the crowd began to disperse, a man stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Marcus. He was tall, with a muscular build and a serious expression on his face. He walked up to Marcus, stopping just a few feet away. I saw what happened, the man said, his voice low but filled with respect. And I want to thank you. Marcus turned to look at the man, his expression calm but curious. Thank me? Marcus asked, his voice steady. Yes, the man said, nodding. You handled that situation with more dignity and grace than most people could ever muster. You showed us all what true strength looks like. Marcus didn't respond right away. He just stood there, his eyes locked on the man, his expression unreadable. And then, finally, he nodded. Thank you, Marcus said, his voice calm but sincere. But I was just doing my job. The man smiled, a look of admiration in his eyes. He reached out his hand, and Marcus shook it, the gesture firm and respectful. But as the man turned to leave, something unexpected happened. A loud crash echoed through the air, followed by the sound of shattering glass. Everyone turned to see what had happened, their eyes wide with shock. And what they saw would leave them speechless. A car had crashed into the gates of Buckingham Palace, its front end completely smashed. Smoke was rising from the engine, and the driver was slumped over the wheel, unconscious. The crowd gasped, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. What was going on? Was this an accident? Or was it something more sinister? Marcus didn't hesitate. He immediately sprang into action, rushing towards the car with a sense of urgency. The crowd watched in awe as he pulled the driver out of the car, his movements quick and efficient. But as Marcus laid the driver on the ground, he noticed something strange. The man was wearing a uniform, but it wasn't a military uniform. It was something else entirely. And then, Marcus saw it. A symbol on the man's jacket, one that sent a chill down his spine. It was the symbol of a terrorist organization. Marcus's eyes widened in shock. He quickly turned to the crowd, his voice filled with urgency. Everyone get back, he shouted. Now. The crowd didn't need to be told twice. They immediately began to scatter, their faces filled with fear. But before they could get too far, another loud crash echoed through the air. This time, it was a van, speeding towards the palace gates. The driver was wearing a mask, and the van was filled with armed men. Marcus's heart raced as he realized what was happening. This wasn't just an accident. This was an attack. And he was the only one standing in their way. But what will happen next? Will Marcus be able to stop the attackers? Or will the palace fall into chaos? The answers are coming, but for now, the suspense is killing us. The van screeched to a halt just a few feet from the palace gates, its tires skidding on the pavement. The doors flew open, and armed men poured out, their faces hidden behind masks, their weapons raised and ready. The crowd, already in a state of panic, screamed and scattered in all directions, desperate to get away from the danger. Marcus stood his ground, his training kicking in. He knew he was outnumbered, but he also knew that he couldn't let these men get any closer to the palace. His mind raced as he assessed the situation, trying to come up with a plan. The leader of the group, a tall man with a commanding presence, stepped forward, his eyes locked on Marcus. He raised his weapon, pointing it directly at Marcus's chest. Step aside, the man said, his voice cold and menacing. This doesn't have to end badly for you. Marcus didn't flinch. He stood tall, his eyes steady, his expression calm. He knew that showing fear would only embolden the attackers. I can't do that, Marcus said, his voice firm and unwavering. This is as far as you go. The leader smirked, a cruel mocking expression that sent a chill down Marcus's spine. He took a step closer, his weapon still trained on Marcus. You're brave, the leader said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But bravery won't save you. Marcus didn't respond. He just stood there, his eyes locked on the leader, his mind racing. He knew that he had to act fast, but he also knew that he had to be careful. One wrong move, and it could all be over. And then, just as the leader was about to pull the trigger, something unexpected happened. A loud bang echoed through the air, followed by the sound of shattering glass. The leader's weapon flew out of his hand, landing on the ground a few feet away. He cried out in pain, clutching his hand as he stumbled back. Marcus didn't hesitate. He immediately sprang into action, tackling the leader to the ground. The other attackers, caught off guard by the sudden turn of events, hesitated for a moment, giving Marcus the opportunity he needed. He quickly disarmed the leader, grabbing the weapon and pointing it at the other attackers. His movements were quick and precise, a testament to his years of training. Drop your weapons. Marcus shouted, his voice filled with authority. Now. The attackers hesitated, their eyes darting between Marcus and their fallen leader. They were clearly unsure of what to do, their confidence shaken by the sudden turn of events. And then, one by one, they began to drop their weapons, their hands raised in surrender. Marcus breathed a sigh of relief, but he knew that the danger wasn't over yet. He quickly radioed for backup, his voice calm but urgent. "This is Marcus at the palace gates," he said. "We have a situation. Armed attackers, multiple suspects. Requesting immediate backup." The response came almost immediately. "Copy that, Marcus. Backup is on the way. Hold your position." Marcus nodded, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of additional threats. He knew that he had to stay vigilant, that he couldn't let his guard down for even a second. But as he stood there, his weapon trained on the attackers, he couldn't help but wonder how this had happened. How had these men gotten so close to the palace? And what had they been planning to do? The answers to those questions would have to wait. For now, Marcus's priority was to keep the attackers contained until backup arrived. But just as he was starting to feel a sense of relief, something unexpected happened. One of the attackers, a man who had been lying on the ground, pretending to be unconscious, suddenly sprang to his feet. He pulled out a hidden weapon, pointing it directly at Marcus. Marcus's eyes widened in shock. He didn't have time to react, didn't have time to do anything. The man was too close, too fast. And then, just as the man was about to pull the trigger, a loud shout echoed through the air. "Freeze!" The man hesitated, his eyes darting towards the source of the voice. And in that moment of hesitation, Marcus acted. He lunged forward, tackling the man to the ground. The weapon flew out of the man's hand, landing a few feet away. Marcus quickly disarmed him, pinning him to the ground with all his strength. The man struggled, trying to break free, but Marcus held him down, his grip firm and unyielding. And then, finally, backup arrived. A team of armed officers rushed onto the scene, their weapons drawn, their faces filled with determination. They quickly surrounded the attackers, securing the area and ensuring that no one else could escape. Marcus breathed a sigh of relief, his body finally relaxing as the tension began to ease. He knew that the danger was over, that the attackers had been neutralized. But as he stood there, watching as the attackers were led away in handcuffs, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. This had been too close, too dangerous. And he knew that it was only a matter of time before something like this happened again. But for now, he had done his job. He had protected the palace, and he had kept everyone safe. And as he turned to walk back to his post, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had faced danger head-on, and he had come out on top. But the story doesn't end here. In fact, it's just the beginning. Because what happened next would shock everyone even more. As Marcus returned to his post, he noticed something strange. The car that had crashed into the gates earlier was still there, its engine smoking, its front end completely smashed. But there was something about it that caught his attention. He walked over to the car, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of danger. And then he saw it. A briefcase, lying on the ground next to the car. It was partially open, and inside, Marcus could see something that made his blood run cold. Explosives. Marcus's heart raced as he realized what this meant. The car crash hadn't been an accident. It had been a diversion, a way to distract everyone while the real attack was carried out. And now, the explosives were here, right in front of the palace. Marcus didn't hesitate. He immediately radioed for the bomb squad, his voice filled with urgency. "This is Marcus at the palace gates," he said. "We have a situation. Explosives found near the car. Requesting immediate assistance." The response came almost immediately. "Copy that, Marcus. Bomb squad is on the way. Evacuate the area and secure the perimeter." Marcus nodded, his mind racing as he began to evacuate the area. He knew that he had to act fast, that he couldn't let anyone get too close to the explosives. But as he worked to secure the perimeter, he couldn't help but wonder who was behind this. Who had planned this attack? And what were they trying to achieve? The answers to those questions would have to wait. For now, Marcus's priority was to keep everyone safe. But just as he was starting to feel a sense of relief, something unexpected happened. A loud beeping sound echoed through the air, coming from the briefcase. Marcus's eyes widened in shock as he realized what it was. A timer. The explosives were set to go off, and there was no time to waste. Marcus's heart raced as he realized what he had to do. He had to get the briefcase away from the palace, away from the people. He had to stop the explosion before it was too late. But how? The bomb squad was still on their way, and there was no time to wait. Marcus knew that he had to act fast. He grabbed the briefcase, his hands trembling as he felt the weight of the explosives inside. He knew that this was dangerous, that he was risking his life. But he also knew that he had no choice. And so, with a deep breath, Marcus began to run. He ran as fast as he could, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind focused on one thing, getting the briefcase as far away from the palace as possible. But as he ran, he couldn't help but wonder if he would make it in time. The timer was ticking down, and he had no idea how much time he had left. And then, just as he was about to reach a safe distance, the unthinkable happened. The briefcase exploded. The force of the blast sent Marcus flying through the air, his body slamming into the ground with a sickening thud. The world around him went dark, and for a moment, he thought that it was all over. But then slowly, the world began to come back into focus. Marcus's ears were ringing, his body aching, but he was alive. He had done it. He had stopped the explosion from reaching the palace. But as he lay there, his body battered and bruised, he couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. The attackers had been stopped, but the danger wasn't over yet. And as the bomb squad arrived on the scene, Marcus knew that the story was far from over. But for now, he had done his job. He had protected the palace, and he had kept everyone safe. And as he closed his eyes, letting the darkness take him, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had faced danger head-on, and he had come out on top. But the story doesn't end here. In fact, it's just the beginning. Because what happened next would shock everyone even more. The world was a blur of noise and chaos as Marcus struggled to open his eyes. His body felt heavy, every muscle screaming in protest as he tried to move. The ringing in his ears was deafening, and his vision was clouded with smoke and dust. He could hear voices shouting, footsteps running, and the distant wail of sirens growing louder. But everything felt distant, as if he were underwater, struggling to surface. Marcus. Marcus, can you hear me? A voice broke through the haze, sharp and urgent. Marcus blinked, his vision slowly clearing to reveal a face hovering above him. It was one of the officers from the backup team, his expression a mix of relief and concern. "Yeah, I'm here," Marcus managed to croak, his voice hoarse and barely audible. His throat felt like it was on fire, and every word was a struggle. "Don't move," the officer said, his hands gently pressing Marcus back down as he tried to sit up. "Medics are on their way. You took a hell of a hit." Marcus groaned, his head throbbing as he tried to piece together what had happened. The explosion. The briefcase. He had run with it, trying to get it away from the palace, away from the people. And then, nothing. Just darkness. "The palace," Marcus whispered, his voice strained. "Is it?" "It's safe," the officer assured him, his tone firm. "You did it, Marcus. You stopped them. The bomb didn't reach the palace. You saved everyone." Marcus let out a shaky breath, relief washing over him. He had done it. He had protected the palace, just as he had sworn to do. But the cost. His body ached in ways he had never felt before, and he wasn't sure if he could even stand. The sound of approaching footsteps drew his attention, and he turned his head slightly to see a team of medics rushing towards him, their equipment in hand. They quickly began assessing his injuries, their movements efficient and practiced. "You're lucky to be alive," one of the medics said as they worked. That explosion was close. Too close. Marcus didn't respond. He just lay there, letting them do their job, his mind still racing. He knew he was lucky. But he also knew that this wasn't over. The attackers had been stopped, but there were still questions that needed answers. Who were they? What had they been planning? And why had they targeted the palace? As the medic stabilized him and prepared to move him to a stretcher, Marcus's thoughts turned to the briefcase. The explosives. The timer. It had all been so carefully planned, so meticulously executed. This wasn't just some random act of violence. This was something bigger, something more dangerous. And then, as if on cue, another officer approached, his face grim. "We found something," the officer said, his voice low. "On one of the attackers. A phone. It's encrypted, but we're working on it. We think it might have information about their plans." Marcus's eyes narrowed, his mind racing. A phone. That could be the key to unraveling everything. But it also meant that this wasn't over. If the attackers had been part of a larger group, then there could be more out there. More threats. More danger. We need to find out who they are, Marcus said, his voice stronger now, despite the pain. We need to stop them before they try again. The officer nodded, his expression serious. We're on it. But right now, you need to focus on yourself. Let us handle this. Marcus wanted to argue, to insist that he could help, but he knew the officer was right. He was in no condition to do anything right now. His body was battered, his strength drained. He needed to recover, to heal. But that didn't mean he was out of the fight. As the medics lifted him onto the stretcher and began to wheel him away, Marcus's mind was already working, already planning. He knew that this was just the beginning. The attackers had been stopped, but the real battle was just getting started. And as he was loaded into the ambulance, the sirens blaring as they sped towards the hospital, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of determination. He had faced danger before, and he had come out on top. He would do it again. No matter what it took. But for now, he had to rest. He had to recover. Because the next chapter of this story was going to be even more dangerous, and he needed to be ready. The hospital was a blur of white walls and fluorescent lights. Marcus was wheeled into a private room, where doctors and nurses worked quickly to assess his injuries. He had suffered a concussion, several bruised ribs, and minor burns from the explosion, but overall, he was lucky. It could have been much worse. As he lay in the hospital bed, hooked up to monitors and IVs, Marcus's mind continued to race. He couldn't stop thinking about the attack, about the briefcase, about the phone. He needed answers, and he needed them now. But before he could dwell on it any longer, the door to his room opened, and a familiar face walked in. It was Captain Harris, Marcus's commanding officer. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a no-nonsense attitude and a reputation for getting results. His expression was serious as he approached Marcus's bed, but there was a hint of relief in his eyes. "You gave us quite a scare," Harris said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "But I have to say, Marcus, you handled that situation better than anyone could have expected. You saved a lot of lives today." Marcus nodded, his expression grim. "I did what I had to do. But this isn't over, Captain. Those attackers, they were part of something bigger. We need to find out who they are and what they were planning." Harris's expression darkened. "We're working on it. The phone we recovered is heavily encrypted, but our tech team is doing everything they can to crack it. In the meantime, we've increased security at the palace and other key locations. We're not taking any chances." Marcus nodded again, his mind racing. He knew that Harris was doing everything he could, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The attackers had been bold, and they had come dangerously close to succeeding. If there were more of them out there, they wouldn't wait long to strike again. "I need to get back out there," Marcus said, his voice firm. "I can't just sit here while there's still a threat." Harris shook his head. "Not a chance. You're in no condition to be back on duty. You need to rest, Marcus. Let us handle this." Marcus wanted to argue, but he knew that Harris was right. He was in no shape to be back on the front lines. But that didn't mean he was out of the fight. "Keep me updated," Marcus said, his tone serious. "I need to know what's going on." Harris nodded. "You'll be the first to know. But for now, focus on getting better. We're going to need you at full strength for what's coming next." And with that, Harris turned and left the room, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. But Marcus knew that he wouldn't be alone for long. The next chapter of this story was already unfolding, and he needed to be ready. Because the danger was far from over. And the worst was yet to come. The hospital room was quiet, save for the steady beeping of the heart monitor beside Marcus's bed. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing despite the exhaustion that weighed heavily on his body. The doctors had assured him that he would recover, but the road ahead was long, and Marcus wasn't a patient man. Every second he spent in that bed felt like a second wasted, a second that could have been used to stop whatever was coming next. The door creaked open, and Marcus turned his head to see a nurse stepping inside, her expression kind but professional. "How are you feeling?" she asked as she checked his vitals. "Like I got hit by a truck," Marcus replied, his voice dry. "But I'll live." The nurse smiled softly. "You're lucky to be alive. That explosion could have been much worse. Just take it easy, okay? Your body needs time to heal." Marcus nodded, but his mind was already elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about the attack, about the briefcase, about the encrypted phone. He needed answers, and he needed them now. As the nurse finished her checks and left the room, Marcus reached for the remote on the bedside table and turned on the TV. The news was already covering the incident, the headlines flashing across the screen in bold letters. Terror attack thwarted at Buckingham Palace. Heroic guard saves the day. Marcus frowned as he watched the footage. The reporters were calling him a hero, but he didn't feel like one. He had just done his job. And while he was glad that the palace and the people were safe, he knew that this wasn't over. The attackers had been part of something bigger, something more dangerous. And until they figured out what that was, no one was truly safe. The door opened again, and this time, it was Captain Harris. He looked more serious than usual, his expression grim as he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "We've got a problem," Harris said without preamble. Marcus sat up slightly, wincing at the pain in his ribs. "What is it?" Harris hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his words. "The phone. We managed to crack part of the encryption. There's a message. A warning." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "What kind of warning?" Harris pulled out a tablet and handed it to Marcus. On the screen was a single line of text, written in bold, ominous letters. This was only the beginning. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he read the words. He looked up at Harris, his expression serious. "What does this mean? Who sent this?" Harris shook his head. "We don't know yet. The rest of the phone's data is still encrypted, but our tech team is working on it. In the meantime, we've increased security across the city. We're not taking any chances." Marcus handed the tablet back to Harris, his mind racing. This wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. The attackers had been stopped, but whoever was behind this wasn't done. They were planning something bigger, something worse. "We need to find out who's behind this," Marcus said, his voice firm. "Before they strike again." Harris nodded. "We're doing everything we can. But right now, you need to focus on getting better. We're going to need you at full strength for what's coming next." Marcus wanted to argue, but he knew that Harris was right. He was in no condition to be back on duty. But that didn't mean he was out of the fight. "Keep me updated," Marcus said, his tone serious. "I need to know what's going on." Harris nodded again. "You'll be the first to know. But for now, rest. That's an order." And with that, Harris turned and left the room, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. But Marcus knew that he wouldn't be alone for long. The next chapter of this story was already unfolding, and he needed to be ready. Because the danger was far from over. And the worst was yet to come. The hours passed slowly, each one feeling like an eternity as Marcus lay in the hospital bed, his mind racing. He couldn't stop thinking about the message on the phone, about the warning. This was only the beginning. What did that mean? What were they planning? And how much time did they have to stop it? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, Marcus's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. He turned his head to see a young woman standing in the doorway, her expression hesitant. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice soft. Marcus nodded, curious. "Sure." The woman stepped inside, closing the door behind her. She was in her late 20s, with long brown hair and a kind face. She looked familiar, but Marcus couldn't quite place her. "I'm Emily," she said, introducing herself. "I was there, at the palace. I saw what happened." Marcus's eyes widened in recognition. She was the woman who had stepped in to stop John, the man who had spat in his face. He hadn't seen her since the attack, but he remembered her bravery, her determination. "Emily," Marcus said, his voice warm. "I remember you. Thank you for what you did." Emily shook her head. "I didn't do much. You're the real hero. You saved everyone." Marcus smiled faintly. "I just did my job." Emily hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer to the bed. I wanted to thank you. And to tell you something. Something important." Marcus's expression grew serious. "What is it?" Emily took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "I think I know who's behind this. The attack. It's not over. They're planning something bigger. And I think I can help you stop them." Marcus's heart raced as he listened to her words. This was it. This was the break they needed. "Tell me everything," Marcus said, his voice firm. "We don't have much time." And as Emily began to speak, Marcus knew that the next chapter of this story was about to begin. And it was going to be more dangerous than anything they had faced before. Emily's voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she spoke. She pulled a chair closer to Marcus's bed and sat down, her eyes darting to the door as if she feared someone might overhear. "I work for a tech company," she began, her voice low. "We specialize in cybersecurity. A few weeks ago, we were hired by a private client to develop a secure communication system. At first, it seemed like a standard job, but as we dug deeper, we realized something was off. The client was secretive. Too secretive. They didn't want any records, no paper trail. Everything had to be encrypted, untraceable." Marcus listened intently, his mind racing. "Did you find out who the client was?" Emily shook her head. "No. They used a shell company, and all communications were routed through anonymous servers. But I started noticing patterns. The system they wanted us to build wasn't just for secure communication. It was designed to coordinate something big. Something dangerous." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Like an attack?" Emily nodded. "Exactly. I tried to raise the alarm, but my boss shut me down. He said we couldn't risk losing the client. So I started digging on my own. And that's when I found it, a hidden file on one of the servers. It contained a list of targets. Buckingham Palace was one of them." Marcus's heart pounded as he processed her words. This was bigger than he had thought. Much bigger. "Do you still have access to the file?" Emily hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. But it's heavily encrypted. I've been trying to crack it, but I'm not sure I can do it alone. That's why I came to you. I thought, maybe you could help." Marcus leaned back against the pillows, his mind racing. This was the break they needed, but it was also incredibly dangerous. If Emily was right, then they were dealing with a highly organized group, one that had the resources and the expertise to pull off something catastrophic. "You're taking a big risk by coming to me," Marcus said, his voice serious. "If they find out you're talking to me, you could be in danger." Emily nodded, her expression grim. "I know. But I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. Not after what happened at the palace. Not after what I saw you do." Marcus studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right. We'll do this together. But we need to move fast. Do you have the file with you?" Emily shook her head. "No. It's on a secure server at my office. I can access it, but I'll need your help to get it out without anyone noticing." Marcus thought for a moment, then reached for the phone on the bedside table. He dialed a number, and after a few rings, Captain Harris answered. "Harris," Marcus said, his voice firm. "I need your help. There's someone here who might have information about the attack. We need to act fast." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then Harris's voice came through, sharp and urgent. "I'm on my way. Don't do anything until I get there." Marcus hung up and turned back to Emily. "Captain Harris is on his way. He'll help us get the file. But until then, you need to stay here. It's not safe for you to go back to your office alone." Emily nodded, her expression a mix of relief and fear. "Thank you. I hope we're not too late." Marcus reached out and placed a hand on hers, his touch reassuring. "We'll stop them. Whatever it takes." Captain Harris arrived within minutes, his expression grim as he stepped into the room. He listened carefully as Emily explained everything, his eyes narrowing as she described the encrypted file and the list of targets. "This changes everything," Harris said, his voice low. "If what you're saying is true, then we're dealing with a coordinated attack. And if Buckingham Palace was just the beginning..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Marcus knew what he was thinking. The stakes were higher than ever, and they were running out of time. "We need to get that file," Marcus said, his voice firm. "It's our only lead." Harris nodded. "Agreed. But we need to be careful. If they find out we're onto them, they'll go underground. And we'll lose our chance to stop them." Emily stood up, her expression determined. "I can get the file. But I'll need your help to do it without raising any alarms." Harris studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right. Let's move. But we do this my way. No risks, no mistakes." Emily nodded, and the three of them quickly formulated a plan. They would go to her office under the guise of a routine security check, using Harris's authority to gain access. Once inside, Emily would retrieve the file while Marcus and Harris kept watch. It was a risky plan, but it was their only shot. The office building was quiet, the hall's empty as Emily led Marcus and Harris inside. They moved quickly but carefully, avoiding the security cameras and staying out of sight. Emily's heart raced as they approached the server room, her hands trembling as she entered the access code. The door clicked open, and they stepped inside, the hum of the servers filling the air. Emily quickly located the terminal she needed and began typing, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she accessed the encrypted file. Marcus and Harris stood guard, their eyes scanning the room for any signs of trouble. The tension was palpable, every second feeling like an eternity as they waited for Emily to finish. And then finally she turned to them, her expression a mix of relief and fear. "I've got it," she said, holding up a flash drive. "But we need to go. Now." They didn't need to be told twice. They moved quickly, retracing their steps and slipping out of the building unnoticed. But as they stepped outside, Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Something was wrong. He turned to Harris, his voice low. "Do you feel that?" Harris nodded, his hand instinctively moving to his weapon. "We're being watched." Before they could react, a loud bang echoed through the air, and the ground shook beneath their feet. Marcus turned to see a plume of smoke rising in the distance, the sound of sirens filling the air. "What the hell was that?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Marcus's heart sank as he realized what had happened. "They're already moving. We're out of time." Harris grabbed his radio, his voice urgent. "This is Captain Harris. We have a situation. Multiple explosions reported. Requesting immediate backup." Marcus turned to Emily, his expression grim. "We need to get that file to the authorities. Now." Emily nodded, her face pale but determined. "Let's go." But as they turned to leave, a dark figure stepped out of the shadows, blocking their path. It was a man, his face hidden behind a mask, his eyes cold and menacing. "You shouldn't have gotten involved," the man said, his voice low and threatening. "Now you'll pay the price." Marcus stepped forward, his body tense, his mind racing. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of time. But he wasn't going down without a fight. The man raised his weapon, and Marcus braced himself, ready to face whatever came next. But before the man could pull the trigger, a loud shout echoed through the air. "Freeze!" The man hesitated, his eyes darting towards the source of the voice. And in that moment of hesitation, Marcus acted. He lunged forward, tackling the man to the ground. The weapon flew out of the man's hand, landing a few feet away. Marcus quickly disarmed him, pinning him to the ground with all his strength. The man struggled, trying to break free, but Marcus held him down, his grip firm and unyielding. And then, finally, backup arrived. A team of armed officers rushed onto the scene, their weapons drawn, their faces filled with determination. They quickly surrounded the man, securing the area and ensuring that no one else could escape. Marcus breathed a sigh of relief, his body finally relaxing as the tension began to ease. He knew that the danger wasn't over, but they had bought themselves some time. And as he turned to Emily, holding the flash drive in her trembling hands, he knew that the next chapter of the story was about to begin. And it was going to be more dangerous than anything they had faced before. The chaos of the explosion still echoed in the air as Marcus, Emily, and Captain Harris regrouped. The masked man who had confronted them was now in custody, but Marcus knew this was far from over. The flash drive in Emily's hand held the key to unraveling the entire operation, but time was slipping away. The attackers were already moving, and the city was under threat. "We need to get this to the authorities," Marcus said, his voice urgent as he gestured to the flash drive. "Now." Harris nodded, his face grim. "I've already called it in. A secure team is on their way to take the drive and analyze it. But we need to get out of here. This area isn't safe." Emily clutched the flash drive tightly, her knuckles white. "What if they're watching us? What if they try to stop us before we can get the file to the right people?" Marcus glanced around, his instincts on high alert. The streets were eerily quiet, the usual bustle of the city replaced by an unsettling stillness. He didn't like it. "She's right," he said to Harris. "We need to move fast and stay off the main roads. If they're tracking us, we can't afford to lead them straight to the authorities." Harris hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right. We'll take the back routes. But we need to stay together. No splitting up." The three of them moved quickly, sticking to the shadows and avoiding the main streets. Marcus's body ached with every step, his injuries from the explosion still fresh, but he pushed through the pain. There was no time to rest. Not now. As they turned down a narrow alley, Marcus's senses prickled. Something felt off. He held up a hand, signaling for the others to stop. "Wait," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Harris and Emily froze, their eyes scanning the darkness. "What is it?" Harris asked, his hand hovering near his weapon. Marcus didn't answer. He was listening, his ears straining to pick up any sound. And then he heard it, a faint rustling, like footsteps on gravel. Someone was following them. "We're not alone," Marcus said, his voice low. "Stay close." They moved forward cautiously, their footsteps silent against the pavement. The alley was dimly lit, the only light coming from a flickering street lamp at the far end. Marcus's heart pounded as they approached the exit, his instinct screaming that danger was near. And then, without warning, a figure stepped out of the shadows, blocking their path. It was another masked man, his face obscured, his eyes cold and calculating. He held a weapon in his hand, the barrel pointed directly at Marcus. "You're not going anywhere," the man said, his voice cold and menacing. Marcus's mind raced. They were trapped. The alley was too narrow to retreat, and the man in front of them was blocking their only way out. He glanced at Harris, who gave a slight nod. They were going to have to fight their way through. But before they could make a move, Emily stepped forward, her hands raised in surrender. "Wait," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "You don't have to do this. We can talk. We can figure this out." The man hesitated, his grip on the weapon tightening. "There's nothing to talk about. You've seen too much. You know too much." Marcus's eyes narrowed. This wasn't just about the flash drive. This was about silencing them. Permanently. "Emily, get back," Marcus said, his voice low and urgent. But she didn't move. She stood her ground, her eyes locked on the man in front of her. "You don't have to do this," she repeated, her voice steady now. "You can walk away. You don't have to be part of this." The man's hand wavered, just for a moment. But it was enough. Marcus lunged forward, tackling the man to the ground. The weapon clattered to the pavement, and Marcus quickly disarmed him, pinning him down with all his strength. The man struggled, but Marcus held firm, his grip unyielding. Harris rushed forward, securing the man's hands with zip ties. "Nice work," he said, his voice tight with tension. "But we need to move. Now." Marcus nodded, his breathing heavy as he stood up. His body ached, but he pushed through the pain. They didn't have time to rest. Emily picked up the weapon and handed it to Harris, her hands trembling. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice urgent. "If there are more of them." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Marcus knew what she was thinking. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of time. They moved quickly, leaving the alley and heading towards a nearby safe house that Harris had arranged. The streets were still eerily quiet, the city holding its breath as if waiting for the next explosion, the next attack. When they finally reached the safe house, Marcus felt a small sense of relief. It was a nondescript building, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, with no signs of life. Harris unlocked the door and ushered them inside, his movements quick and efficient. "We'll be safe here," Harris said as he locked the door behind them. "For now." Marcus nodded, his eyes scanning the room. It was sparsely furnished, with a few chairs, a table, and a computer set up in the corner. "We need to get that file analyzed," he said, his voice firm. "Every second we waste is another second they have to plan their next move." Emily handed the flash drive to Harris, who plugged it into the computer. The screen flickered to life, and they watched as the file began to load. The encryption was complex, but Harris had access to tools that could crack it. As they waited, Marcus turned to Emily. "You did good back there," he said, his voice soft. "You kept your cool. That's not easy to do." Emily smiled faintly, but her eyes were still filled with fear. I don't want anyone else to get hurt. Not after what happened at the palace." Marcus nodded, his expression grim. "We'll stop them. Whatever it takes." The computer beeped, drawing their attention back to the screen. The file had been decrypted, and the contents were now visible. Harris's eyes widened as he scanned the information. "This is bad," he said, his voice tight. "Really bad." Marcus leaned over his shoulder, his heart sinking as he read the details. The file contained a list of targets, not just in London, but across the country. Government buildings, transportation hubs, even schools and hospitals. The scale of the attack was staggering. "They're planning a coordinated strike," Harris said, his voice grim. "And it's happening soon. Very soon." Marcus's mind raced. They had to warn the authorities, but they couldn't risk tipping off the attackers. If they moved too quickly, the entire operation could go underground. "We need to get this to the right people," Marcus said, his voice urgent. "But we have to be careful. If they find out we have this information." He didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew what was at stake. Harris nodded, his expression serious. "I'll make the call. But we need to stay here until backup arrives. It's not safe to move." Marcus agreed, but he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. They were sitting ducks in this safe house, and if the attackers found them... His thoughts were interrupted by a loud crash from outside. The sound of shattering glass filled the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Marcus's heart raced as he turned to Harris. "They're here." Harris grabbed his weapon, his expression grim. "Get Emily to safety. I'll hold them off." Marcus nodded, his mind racing. They were out of time. And the next chapter of this story was about to begin. But this time, they might not make it out alive. The sound of footsteps grew louder, echoing through the safe house like a death knell. Marcus's heart pounded as he grabbed Emily's arm and pulled her towards the back of the room. "Stay behind me," he whispered, his voice tight with urgency. Emily nodded, her face pale but determined. She clutched the flash drive tightly, her knuckles white. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Marcus didn't answer. His mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan. The safe house had a back exit, but it was blocked by a heavy bookshelf. If they could move it quickly, they might have a chance to escape. "Harris," Marcus said, his voice low. "We need to get out of here. Now." Harris nodded, his weapon raised as he kept his eyes on the door. "Go. I'll cover you." Marcus didn't waste any time. He rushed to the bookshelf, his muscles straining as he pushed with all his strength. Emily joined him, her smaller frame adding just enough force to shift the heavy piece of furniture. With a loud scrape, the bookshelf moved just enough to reveal the door. "Go," Marcus said, gesturing for Emily to move. She slipped through the narrow opening, and Marcus followed close behind. The back alley was dark and empty, the only sound the distant wail of sirens. Marcus grabbed Emily's hand and pulled her forward, his eyes scanning the shadows for any signs of danger. They needed to get as far away from the safe house as possible. But before they could take more than a few steps, a loud crash echoed from inside the building. Marcus turned just in time to see Harris being thrown against the wall, his weapon clattering to the ground. Two masked men stepped into view, their weapons raised. "Run!" Marcus shouted, pushing Emily forward. "Don't stop." Emily didn't need to be told twice. She took off down the alley, her footsteps quick and light. Marcus followed close behind, his body aching with every step. He could hear the sound of pursuit behind them, the masked men closing in fast. The alley twisted and turned, the narrow walls closing in around them. Marcus's mind raced as he tried to remember the layout of the area. They needed to find a way out, a place to hide anything. And then up ahead he saw it, a narrow gap between two buildings, just wide enough for them to slip through. "This way," Marcus said, pulling Emily towards the gap. They squeezed through, their bodies scraping against the rough brick walls. On the other side was another alley, this one even darker and more secluded. Marcus paused for a moment, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice low. "They're still behind us." Emily nodded, her face pale but determined. "Where do we go?" Marcus thought for a moment, then pointed towards a nearby street. "There's a police station a few blocks from here. If we can make it there, we'll be safe." Emily hesitated, her eyes darting back towards the gap they had just come through. "What about Harris? We can't just leave him." Marcus's heart ached at the thought, but he knew they didn't have a choice. "Harris knew the risks," he said, his voice firm. "Right now, we need to focus on getting this information to the authorities. That's the only way we can stop them." Emily nodded, her expression grim. "All right. Let's go." They moved quickly, sticking to the shadows and avoiding the main streets. The sound of pursuit had faded, but Marcus knew they weren't out of danger yet. The attackers were still out there, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. As they approached the police station, Marcus felt a small sense of relief. The building was well lit, with officers patrolling the perimeter. They were almost there. But just as they were about to step into the light, a hand grabbed Marcus from behind, yanking him into the shadows. He struggled, his instincts kicking in as he tried to break free. "Quiet," a voice hissed in his ear. "It's me." Marcus froze, his heart racing. He recognized that voice. It was Harris. "Harris," Marcus whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. "How did you?" "No time to explain," Harris said, his voice tight. "We need to move. Now." Marcus nodded, his mind racing. He turned to Emily, who was staring at Harris with wide eyes. "It's okay," Marcus said, his voice low. "He's with us." Emily nodded, but her expression was still filled with fear. "What's going on?" Harris didn't answer. He just gestured for them to follow him, his movements quick and efficient. They moved through the shadows, avoiding the police station and heading towards a nearby parking garage. "We can't trust the authorities," Harris said as they reached the garage. "Not all of them, anyway. There's a leak. That's how they found us at the safe house." Marcus's heart sank. If the attackers had infiltrated the police, then they were in even more danger than he had thought. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice urgent. Harris led them to a car parked in the corner of the garage. "We go off the grid," he said, his voice firm. "We'll take this car and get as far away from here as possible. Then we'll figure out our next move." Marcus nodded, his mind racing. They were running out of options, and time was slipping away. As they climbed into the car, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of unease. They were in deeper than he had ever imagined, and the stakes were higher than ever. But as Harris started the engine and pulled out of the garage, Marcus knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The car sped through the empty streets, the city lights blurring into a haze of color. Marcus sat in the passenger seat, his eyes scanning the road for any signs of danger. Emily was in the back, her hands clutching the flash drive as if it were a lifeline. "Where are we going?" Marcus asked, his voice low. Harris didn't answer right away. His eyes were focused on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Somewhere safe," he said finally. "Somewhere they won't find us." Marcus nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. They were running blind, with no plan and no backup. And the attackers were still out there, waiting for their next move. As they drove, Marcus's mind raced. They needed a plan, a way to use the information on the flash drive to stop the attackers. But without knowing who they could trust, it was almost impossible. And then, as if reading his thoughts, Harris spoke. "We need to find someone we can trust," Harris said, his voice firm. "Someone outside the system. Someone who can help us take these guys down." Marcus frowned. "Who?" Harris hesitated for a moment, then nodded as if coming to a decision. "There's someone. An old contact of mine. He's unconventional, but he's good. If anyone can help us, it's him." Marcus didn't like the sound of that, but he knew they didn't have a choice. "All right," he said, his voice firm. "Let's do it." Harris nodded, his expression grim. "Hold on. This is going to be a rough ride." And with that, he turned the car onto a side street, heading towards the unknown. The next chapter of this story was about to begin, and it was going to be more dangerous than anything they had faced before. The car sped through the winding streets, the city lights fading into the distance as they left the urban sprawl behind. Harris drove with a focused intensity, his eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror to check for tails. Marcus sat in silence, his mind racing as he tried to piece together their next move. Emily, still clutching the flash drive, stared out the window, her face pale but resolute. After what felt like hours, Harris finally pulled off the main road and onto a narrow gravel path that led into a dense forest. The trees loomed overhead, their branches casting long shadows in the moonlight. The car bounced over the uneven terrain, the headlights cutting through the darkness like a knife. "Where are we going?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Somewhere safe," Harris replied, his tone clipped. "An old safe house. Off the books. No one knows about it except me and a few trusted contacts." Marcus frowned. "And this contact of yours, he'll be there?" Harris nodded. "If he's still alive, yeah. He's the kind of guy who doesn't stay in one place for too long, but this is one of his bolt holes. If we're lucky, he'll be there." Marcus didn't like the sound of that. And if we're not lucky? Harris didn't answer. He just kept driving, his jaw clenched tight. The car finally came to a stop in front of a small, dilapidated cabin tucked deep in the woods. The place looked abandoned, with boarded-up windows and a sagging roof. But as they stepped out of the car, Marcus noticed subtle signs of life, a faint light flickering through the cracks in the boards, the sound of movement inside. Harris approached the door cautiously, his hand resting on his weapon. He knocked 3 times, paused, then knocked twice more. A code. For a moment, there was silence. Then the door creaked open, revealing a man with a grizzled beard and piercing eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, his clothes rumpled and his face lined with exhaustion. But there was a sharpness to his gaze, a calculating intelligence that made Marcus instantly wary. "Harris," the man said, his voice gravelly. "It's been a while." "Too long," Harris replied, stepping inside. "We need your help, Jack." Jack's eyes flicked to Marcus and Emily, his expression unreadable. "Who's the company?" "Marcus," Harris said, gesturing to him. "And Emily." "They're with me." Jack studied them for a moment, then nodded. "Come in. But make it quick. I don't like visitors." The inside of the cabin was cluttered with old equipment, computers, radios, maps, and stacks of papers covered in handwritten notes. It looked like the lair of a conspiracy theorist, but Marcus could tell that everything had a purpose. This man was a professional, and he wasn't to be underestimated. Jack sat down at a makeshift desk, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Harris. "What's the situation?" Harris didn't mince words. "We've got a terrorist cell planning a coordinated attack. Multiple targets, nationwide. We have a flash drive with intel, but we can't trust the authorities. There's a leak." Jack's expression darkened. "And you came to me because you're the only one I trust to handle this off the books," Harris said. "We need to decrypt the file, analyze the intel, and figure out how to stop these guys before they strike." Jack leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "You're asking a lot." "I know," Harris said. "But if we don't stop them, a lot of people are going to die." Jack was silent for a moment, his eyes flicking between Harris, Marcus, and Emily. Then he nodded. "All right. Give me the drive." Emily hesitated, then handed the flash drive to Jack. He plugged it into one of his computers, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he began to work. The screen filled with lines of code, and Jack's eyes narrowed as he studied the data. "This is heavy encryption," he muttered. "Military grade. Whoever put this together knows what they're doing. Can you crack it?" Marcus asked, his voice tense. Jack didn't answer. He just kept typing, his focus unwavering. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the tension in the room growing thicker with each passing second. Finally, Jack leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "Got it." The screen filled with a list of files, each one labeled with a code name. Jack clicked on the first one, and the room fell silent as they read the contents. It was worse than they had imagined. The file contained detailed plans for attacks on government buildings, transportation hubs, and public spaces. The targets were spread across the country, and the timeline was tight. Some of the attacks were scheduled to happen within the next 24 hours. "This is massive," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "How are we supposed to stop this?" Jack didn't answer. He was already pulling up maps and cross-referencing the data, his fingers moving furiously across the keyboard. "We need to prioritize," he said, his voice sharp. "Some of these targets are more vulnerable than others. If we can disrupt their plans at key locations, we might be able to buy ourselves some time." Marcus stepped forward, his eyes scanning the screen. "What do you need from us?" Jack looked up, his gaze piercing. "I need you to be ready to move. Once I've identified the most critical targets, we'll need to act fast. No hesitation, no mistakes." Marcus nodded, his jaw clenched. "We're ready." Jack turned back to the computer, his focus unwavering. The room fell silent again, the only sound the soft hum of the machines and the occasional clack of the keyboard. But as Marcus watched Jack work, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. They were running out of time, and the stakes were higher than ever. And then, just as Jack was about to speak, the sound of a twig snapping outside made them all freeze. Marcus's heart raced as he turned to the window, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. "Did you hear that?" Harris nodded, his expression grim. "We've got company." The door burst open before anyone could react, and a group of armed men stormed inside. They were dressed in black, their faces obscured by masks, their weapons raised and ready. "Hands up," one of them barked, his voice cold and menacing. Marcus's mind raced as he raised his hands, his eyes darting around the room for an escape route. But there was none. They were trapped. Jack slowly stood up, his hands raised as well. But there was a glint in his eyes, a calculating look that made Marcus wonder if he had a plan. "You're making a mistake," Jack said, his voice calm but firm. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The leader of the group stepped forward, his weapon trained on Jack. "We know exactly who we're dealing with. And you're coming with us." Marcus's heart pounded as he exchanged a glance with Harris. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options. But as the masked men moved to secure them, Jack's hand twitched, and the room was suddenly plunged into darkness. "Move!" Jack shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Marcus didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed Emily's arm and pulled her towards the back of the cabin, his instincts kicking in as he searched for a way out. The sound of shouting and scuffling filled the air, but Marcus didn't look back. He just kept moving, his only thought to get Emily to safety. They burst out the back door and into the woods, the cold night air hitting them like a slap. Marcus could hear the sound of pursuit behind them, but he didn't stop. He just kept running, his heart pounding in his chest. And then, just as they reached the edge of the woods, a loud explosion rocked the cabin, sending a plume of fire and smoke into the sky. Marcus turned, his eyes wide with shock. "Harris! Jack!" But there was no time to go back. The sound of footsteps behind them was growing louder, and Marcus knew they had to keep moving. "Come on," he said, pulling Emily forward. "We need to get out of here." Emily nodded, her face pale but determined. "Where do we go?" Marcus didn't answer. He just kept running, his mind racing as he tried to come up with a plan. The next chapter of this story was about to begin, and it was going to be more dangerous than anything they had faced before. The forest was a blur of shadows and moonlight as Marcus and Emily ran, their footsteps crunching against the underbrush. The explosion at the cabin still echoed in their ears, the image of the fireball seared into their minds. Marcus's heart pounded as he pushed forward, his body aching but his resolve unshaken. They couldn't stop. Not now. Emily stumbled beside him, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Marcus, we can't keep running like this. We need a plan." Marcus slowed, his eyes scanning the darkness. She was right. They couldn't keep running blindly. They needed to regroup, to figure out their next move. But with the attackers closing in and no safe haven in sight, their options were dwindling fast. "We need to get to the authorities," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. "But we can't trust anyone. Not after what happened at the safe house." Emily nodded, her face pale but determined. "What about the flash drive? Did Jack manage to decrypt all of it before?" Marcus hesitated. He hadn't seen what happened to Jack or Harris after the explosion. For all he knew, they were gone. But the flash drive, the information on it was their only hope. If they could get it to someone they could trust, someone outside the system, they might still have a chance to stop the attacks. "We still have the drive," Marcus said, pulling it from his pocket. "But we need to find someone who can use it. Someone who's not compromised." Emily's eyes widened. "What about the media? If we can get this to a journalist, someone who can expose the whole thing, maybe we can force their hand." Marcus considered it. It was risky. Going public with the information could tip off the attackers and put even more people in danger. But at this point, they were out of options. They needed to act fast. "All right," Marcus said, nodding. "But we need to be careful. If they're watching the media outlets, we'll have to find someone who's not on their radar." Emily thought for a moment, then snapped her fingers. "I know someone. A friend of mine works for an independent news site. She's not big, but she's trustworthy. And she's not connected to any of the major networks." Marcus nodded. "Let's do it. But we need to move fast." They took off again, this time with a clear destination in mind. The forest gave way to a quiet suburban neighborhood, the streets empty and silent. Marcus kept to the shadows, his eyes scanning for any signs of danger. Emily followed close behind, her phone in hand as she texted her friend. "She's at her office," Emily whispered as they approached a small, nondescript building. "She's waiting for us." Marcus nodded, his hand resting on his weapon as they approached the door. He knocked softly, and after a moment, It creaked open to reveal a young woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense expression. "Emily," the woman said, her voice low. "What's going on? You said it was urgent." Emily stepped inside, pulling Marcus with her. "Sarah, this is Marcus. We need your help. There's something big happening, and we need to get the word out." Sarah's eyes narrowed as she looked between them. "What kind of something?" Marcus handed her the flash drive. "This contains evidence of a coordinated terrorist attack. Multiple targets, nationwide. The authorities are compromised, and we need to expose this before it's too late." Sarah's expression turned serious as she took the drive. "You're sure about this?" Marcus nodded. "We're out of time. If we don't act now, a lot of people are going to die." Sarah didn't hesitate. She plugged the drive into her computer and began scanning the files, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the machines and the occasional click of the mouse. Finally, Sarah leaned back in her chair, her face pale. This is huge. If this is real, we're talking about a catastrophe." "It's real," Emily said, her voice trembling. "We saw it with our own eyes." Sarah nodded, her expression grim. "All right. I'll get this out. But it's going to take some time to verify everything and get it ready for publication." Marcus shook his head. "We don't have time. You need to get this out now. Even if it's not perfect, people need to know." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "All right. I'll do it." She began typing furiously, her eyes glued to the screen. Marcus and Emily watched in silence, the tension in the room palpable. Every second felt like an eternity, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on them. And then, just as Sarah was about to hit publish, the sound of breaking glass shattered the silence. Marcus spun around, his weapon drawn as the door burst open. Masked men stormed inside, their weapons raised and ready. "Hands up," one of them barked, his voice cold and menacing. Marcus didn't hesitate. He fired, taking down the first man before diving behind a desk for cover. Emily and Sarah dropped to the floor, their hands over their heads as the room erupted into chaos. The sound of gunfire filled the air, the walls shaking with the force of the shots. Marcus returned fire, his movements quick and precise. He knew they were outnumbered, but he wasn't going down without a fight. And then, just as the attackers began to close in, the sound of sirens filled the air. The masked men hesitated, their eyes darting towards the door. Marcus seized the opportunity, firing another round and forcing them back. "The police!" Emily shouted, her voice filled with relief. But Marcus didn't share her optimism. If the authorities were compromised, the police might not be on their side. They needed to get out of here. "Come on!" Marcus shouted, grabbing Emily's arm and pulling her towards the back door. Sarah followed close behind, her laptop clutched tightly to her chest. They burst out into the alley, the sound of sirens growing louder. Marcus scanned the area, his mind racing as he tried to come up with a plan. And then he saw it, a van parked at the end of the alley, its engine running. The door slid open, and a familiar face peered out. "Get in!" Harris shouted, his voice urgent. Marcus didn't hesitate. He pushed Emily and Sarah towards the van, his weapon raised as he covered their retreat. The sound of gunfire echoed behind them, but Marcus didn't look back. He just kept moving, his only thought to get them to safety. They piled into the van, and Harris hit the gas, the tires screeching as they sped away. Marcus turned to Harris, his heart racing. "I thought you were dead." Harris shook his head, his expression grim. "Not yet. But we're not out of the woods. Those guys aren't going to stop until they get what they want." Marcus nodded, his jaw clenched. "We need to end this. Now." Harris glanced at Sarah, who was still clutching her laptop. "Did you get the information out?" Sarah nodded, her face pale but determined. "It's live. The whole world knows now." Marcus felt a small sense of relief, but it was short-lived. The attackers were still out there, and they weren't going to give up without a fight. As the van sped through the streets, Marcus turned to Emily, his voice low. "This isn't over." "Not yet." Emily nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "We'll stop them. Whatever it takes." Marcus didn't answer. He just stared out the window, his mind racing as he prepared for the final showdown. The van screeched to a halt in an abandoned industrial complex on the outskirts of the city. The sirens were distant now, But Marcus knew they couldn't afford to let their guard down. The attackers were still out there, and they were desperate. The information Sarah had published was spreading like wildfire, but it had also put a target on their backs. The clock was ticking. Harris killed the engine and turned to face the group, his expression grim. We need to move fast. They'll be coming for us, and we can't let them get their hands on that flash drive or anyone who knows what's on it. Marcus nodded, his mind racing. What's the plan? Harris hesitated for a moment, then reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a map. He spread it out on the dashboard, his finger tracing a route. There's a safe house about 20 miles from here. It's off the grid, completely untraceable. If we can get there, we can regroup and figure out our next move. Emily leaned forward, her eyes scanning the map. What about the attacks? The information's out there, but we still don't know if it's enough to stop them. Sarah, still clutching her laptop, shook her head. The authorities are scrambling. I've been monitoring the news. They're locking down the targets, evacuating areas, and increasing security. But it's chaos. They don't know who to trust. Marcus clenched his fists. We need to do more. We can't just sit back and hope they figure it out. Harris nodded. Agreed. But we're outnumbered and outgunned. We need to be smart about this. Before anyone could respond, the sound of engines roaring in the distance cut through the silence. Marcus's heart sank as he turned to see headlights approaching fast. They found us, Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Harris cursed under his breath. We need to move. Now. They piled out of the van, Marcus grabbing the flash drive and shoving it into his pocket. Harris led the way, his weapon drawn as they sprinted towards the nearest building. The sound of tires screeching and doors slamming echoed behind them, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Inside. Harris shouted, kicking open a rusted door and ushering everyone in. The building was dark and filled with debris, the air thick with dust. Marcus scanned the room, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. We need to find a way out of here. They'll be on us any second. Harris nodded, his expression grim. There's a back exit. Follow me. They moved quickly, their footsteps echoing through the empty building. But before they could reach the exit, the sound of voices and footsteps closing in made them freeze. They're inside, Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Marcus's mind raced. They were trapped, with no way out and no backup. But he wasn't going down without a fight. Stay behind me, Marcus said, his voice low but firm. He raised his weapon, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and then without warning, a group of masked men burst into the room, their weapons raised. Drop your weapons, one of them barked, his voice cold and menacing. Marcus didn't hesitate. He fired, taking down the first man before diving behind a stack of crates for cover. Harris returned fire, his movements quick and precise. The room erupted into chaos, the sound of gunfire deafening. Emily and Sarah crouched behind an overturned table, their hands over their heads as bullets ricocheted off the walls. Marcus's heart pounded as he returned fire, his mind focused on one thing, protecting them. But the attackers were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. Marcus knew they couldn't hold them off forever. And then, just as the situation seemed hopeless, the sound of sirens filled the air. The masked men hesitated, their eyes darting towards the door. Marcus seized the opportunity, firing another round and forcing them back. The police. Emily shouted, her voice filled with relief. But Marcus didn't share her optimism. If the authorities were compromised, the police might not be on their side. They needed to get out of here. Come on. Marcus shouted, grabbing Emily's arm and pulling her towards the back exit. Harris and Sarah followed close behind, their footsteps quick and urgent. They burst out into the night, the cold air hitting them like a slap. The sound of sirens was growing louder, but Marcus didn't stop. He just kept running, his only thought to get them to safety. And then, just as they reached the edge of the complex, a loud explosion rocked the building behind them, sending a plume of fire and smoke into the sky. Marcus turned, his eyes wide with shock. Harris! But there was no time to go back. The sound of footsteps behind them was growing louder, and Marcus knew they had to keep moving. Come on, he said, pulling Emily forward. We need to get out of here. Emily nodded, her face pale but determined. Where do we go? Marcus didn't answer. He just kept running, his mind racing as he tried to come up with a plan. Hours later, they found themselves in a small, secluded cabin deep in the woods. It was a far cry from safety, but it was the best they could do for now. Marcus sat by the window, his weapon resting on his lap as he kept watch. Emily and Sarah were asleep on the floor, their exhaustion finally catching up with them. Harris was gone. Marcus didn't know if he had made it out of the building alive, but he refused to give up hope. They had come too far to lose now. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, Marcus's thoughts turned to the flash drive. The information on it had been released to the world, but the fight wasn't over. The attackers were still out there, and they wouldn't stop until they had been brought to justice. Marcus knew that this was just the beginning. The next chapter of their story would be even more dangerous, but he was ready. He had faced death before, and he wasn't afraid to do it again. For now, though, they were safe. And that was enough. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his eyes closing as he allowed himself a moment of rest. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he knew they would face it together. And as the sun rose over the horizon, Marcus felt a small sense of hope. They had survived the night, and they would survive whatever came next.